of you discovered that as we were moving around through the icebreaker, and that was great, by the way. Thank you for doing that. And I'm a progressive Democrat running for state treasurer. So I have had this great job the last 7 years representing my district up in Greeley. For the past 4, I've been on the Joint Budget Committee. How many of you know anything about the Joint Budget Committee? Oh, I see. I've got a little bit of educating to do, and that's been a really amazing and a great learning experience for me. But the greatest job that I've had over my career, the one I held for almost 25 years, is that I was a teacher. I taught junior high math, science, and technology up in Greeley for those 25 years, and I actually taught also at the University of Colorado downtown Denver campus in a master's program as well. So I would say of all the things I've done in my life, teaching has been the thing that really drives me forward, and you'll hear me talk about some of my big concerns. Are you Sarah, by the way? All right.
Yeah.
I'm going to be stamping on some of your stuff.
That's fine, no, please.
And maybe at some point we're going to actually come together and have some conversation about some things where we overlap a little bit.
Sure.
So just like Phil did, what does the treasurer do? Well, the Joint Budget Committee that I'm on actually manages the state's $30 billion budget. That's the size of our budget. We have about $11 billion that's discretionary, and the rest is federal funds and fees that are paid in. The treasurer actually manages a portfolio of about, on the average, $7 billion, and that's tax revenue that comes in, and then along with the controller writes the warrants to send the money back out when the bills come due. And the Joint Budget Committee decides through their work, and I'm chair of the Appropriations Committee for the House, we decide what funding goes where, and then the Treasurer's Office is supposed to manage the money, invest the money, very safe, liquid, available, so that when the checks need to be written, then the money goes back out the door to the right places. So a lot of technical work there. The Treasurer sits on the PARA board. How many of you have heard of PARA in the news? Now we're getting somewhere where people are aware. Public Employees Retirement Association. I'm a member of PARA. My wife is. We're both educators. How many of you are PARA members? Okay, a few of you are. And so we're right in the middle, and we're in the last 3 days, coming up tomorrow and Tuesday and Wednesday, the last 3 days of the legislative session. And Senate Bill 200, which is a fix to PARA, is still working its way through the legislative session, right down to the wire, which is what we typically do in the legislature. The Joint Budget Committee set aside $225 million out of our revenue this go around as a system to help support that solution that's coming forward. But frankly, there's going to be a conference committee coming where the House members have to sit with the Republican Senate members and actually negotiate a deal. And so we're hoping that we can get through that process. It's very important that we actually come up with a fair deal this go around, but it's important that we come up with one this go around. We actually, if we don't fix the problem, we do put our bond rating as a state at risk, and this is something that the Treasurer cares deeply about, and you should too, because when your bond rating is impacted, then we pay more in interest when we do bond, or what we do with under Tabor is called certificates of participation. It's a similar process, and it costs us a little more when our bond rating goes down. So it's important not only for the people in PARA right now, over 500,000 people in Colorado that are affected by this, but statewide, all of us are impacted if we don't get a fair fix to PARA. In the bigger picture, what I'm most concerned about as a former teacher and an educator, and now as I've sat with the Joint Budget Committee, is this knot that we have in our Colorado Constitution, this collision between Tabor and Gallagher. So the Tabor Amendment Phil referred to, how many of you are familiar with Tabor? See, I'm a teacher. I've always got to get feedback from you, right? How about Gallagher? How many of you are familiar with Gallagher? Maybe not as much. Gallagher went into the Colorado Constitution in 1982. It was a response to skyrocketing residential property taxes. And then 10 years later, Tabor went into the Colorado Constitution, never contemplated playing well with the Gallagher Amendment at all, and collides with it on a regular basis. And the crisis that we have in funding in the state of Colorado in almost every aspect of our budget is a direct result of this collision of Tabor and Gallagher. And even outside of that, even outside of state government, your school districts are suffering, your fire protection districts are suffering, several other types of special districts are really in crisis as well. So it's not just the funding coming from the state, but it's lots of other areas that you see this coming as well. I think the treasurer ought to play a lead role in mapping a pathway to fixing this problem. I don't think the treasurer alone can solve the problem. I think it's going to be a huge, huge process of getting everybody together and actually saying, how do we do a better job of investing in ourselves as a state? So I want to stop it there, and I want to back up on that point. Okay? Our current treasurer, Walker Stapleton, who is running for governor as a Republican, has spent the last 8 years bashing para, and some of that concern was well raised, but it's been very negative tone that somehow people should have less in retirement, and somehow that solves problems if we do that. It's also been very negative about the overall status of our finances from the standpoint that a lot of our money is invested in Wells Fargo right now. Those amounts that I talked about, on the average, $7 billion that has to be liquid, a lot of that is invested in Wells Fargo and other banks. We should never invest in a bank that breaks the rules, because the number one job of the treasurer is to make sure your money is safe and wisely invested. And if you're investing in some company or some asset where there's rule breaking involved, you can't guarantee that the money is safe. So that's the number one job of the treasurer.
Quick question.
Sure.
Invested in Wells Fargo Bank, or because it's also an investment firm? It's
right.
Their
asset.
Connected, but
yeah, our money, our liquid money, is actually in Wells Fargo.
In Wells Fargo Bank.
Right. Now, I know the Colorado part is doing their best to be better, but it's part of a larger organization that has really had egregious behavior. I think we've all seen that. And so the treasurer ought to play a role in ensuring that we push our corporate folks in Colorado to better behavior. And you do that through the way you manage the money. We do the same thing in para. Okay? Right now, a small amount, but still an amount, is invested in gun manufacturers. Why would we do that? Can we modify that behavior? And I have a front row seat of this in Weld County. You know, whenever there's a scare on somehow somebody's going to take your guns, a lot of people go out and buy guns. A lot of people who can't really afford to buy a lot of guns end up buying guns. And, you know, this behavior is really connected. The NRA ginning up the fear, and then the gun manufacturers benefiting from that. Can we as a state say we're not going to, you know, feed that cycle of craziness that we see, and ask for better behavior? I think that this is something that we can do as a state. So there's some leverage points that the treasurer can actually engage in. Can we invest in ourselves? Instead of putting our money in Wells Fargo, or at least as large amount as we do, could we invest in a public bank? How many of you are familiar with public banking? Okay. Well, we have community banks, and we should invest more in them. Those liberals in North Dakota have a public bank. They have a state bank. They have a state bank. They've had it for almost a century. They did it because they're a farming, I mean, at that time it was a farming community, still is, and they didn't want their money going to Wall Street. They wanted to keep it in their state, and they wanted to invest it in ways that they wanted to benefit from. I think the same is still true today. We could do the same thing. I'm from Weld County, one of the top 10 producing agricultural counties in the country. And so I say that's, silly, that those liberals in North Dakota. But this is, I think, a topic that could resonate no matter whether you're a Republican, unaffiliated, or Democrat. How do we keep our money here in the state of Colorado, and how do we invest so that we actually benefit our citizens as shareholders and not the 1% on Wall Street? And so this is kind of a theme. I don't think we've come up with our theme for our campaign post the session here, but investing in ourselves is important to me. And so let me back up a little bit to this issue around schools. So I went around the state in the fall before I'd even announced to run as state treasurer, because I was invited by the Colorado Association of School Boards to come to one regional meeting up in northern Colorado. And I said, I really care a lot about this issue, and I want to see what's going on in education all around the state. You all know we have a hot economy here in the state of Colorado. If not the top economy, it's one of the top economies in the country. So you go out in rural Colorado, or you go up into non-resort towns in mountain Colorado, or you're down in the valley, San Luis Valley, down in southern Colorado, and you see a devastated K-12 school system. Devastated. How many of you know that more than half the schools in the state of Colorado are on 4-day weeks? Really? We're going the wrong direction. Now, I'm never one that just says more seat time actually results in better education. But, you can see the trend, 5 to 4 to 3. I mean, where are we heading here? We're heading the wrong direction. And so we need to actually invest in ourselves. We need to invest in our schools. We saw 10,000 teachers at the Capitol saying, it's not just about my paycheck, it's about the deplorable conditions at our schools, and they're there, often with support of their school boards and their superintendents, saying you got to do something about this. It's a crisis. We have a school district, Pueblo 60, that has voted to strike. We have real problems that we have to solve. How did we get here? Well, Tabor and Gallagher have created this problem. And as I get down towards the end, I'm going to start to talk about Sarah's Initiative 93 that she's going to speak a little bit about as well, because I'm supporting that in addition to, I think, a lot of other people. How many of you have heard about Initiative 93? Few. All right, so you got.
I have petitions here. So
great, because I have two packs in the car and they're all filled up, and I got to get them notarized and turn them in.
Cool.
Okay?
I have them to give out to people who want to carry them.
Great.
Yeah,
that's even better.
That's one of the things I'm here for. Yep.
Yeah, so this is a grassroots effort.
I had heard that it was half of the school districts with the 4-day week, not half of the schools.
Well, there's half of the districts have at least one school. Let me put it in the right context.
Okay.
Half of the school districts have at least one school that's on a 4-day
Yeah.
week. But I mean, even if you go, I think a lot of times what happens to people is they drive by the school, it's still standing, so you make the assumption everything's okay. But when you go inside there, you'll see large class sizes. You'll see teachers that are really overworked, underpaid. You'll see buildings that are in great disrepair and need a lot of attention. And students, really, especially at-risk students, students in poverty, students with multiple language difficulties, students on the special ed, special needs, either one end of the spectrum or the other, gifted and talented or special needs, that aren't getting the services that they need to move forward. And so what was interesting was the superintendents ID'd this over the last 3 or 4 years. They've been working, trying to come up with a better way to distribute our money in order to actually make sure that regardless of your zip code, students get the kind of support and services that they need in order to move forward. And we have a U.S. Supreme Court ruling coming out of Douglas County that even puts an exclamation point on that. And I didn't get a chance to bug Phil about that, but it would have been interesting to get his sense of that. We have a Supreme Court ruling that says it's not enough to do minimal work for special ed students. You actually have to provide them with the kinds of resources and support they need to be successful. This is important to me because the reason I got into being a state representative is because my sister's intellectually developmentally disabled. So she went to school down in Colorado Springs at a time where there was no law that required special ed services at all. It was pre-Public Law 94-142, and when she went to kindergarten in, I think it was 1961, she spent half a day in kindergarten, and the school called her up and said, don't bring her back tomorrow. We're not required to serve her. We don't have the expertise or the resources to serve her, so just keep her at home from now on. For people that haven't lived through this and have always been under IDEA, you just think that that's a requirement and that's the way it's always been, but it hasn't always been that way. And so it's great that we have that, but the federal government never actually funded what we needed for the resources, and the state has been scrambling ever since, pitting one student against another. It's not healthy. And so I'm starting with public education as on the campaign trail with Treasurer to say, this is something we all care about. And the conversation I get all the time is, well, we care about our schools. Why isn't the state legislature funding our schools? And the answer is, we don't have the resources. We don't have the revenue in order to be able to do that. People say, well, why don't you have it? Tabor and Gallagher, that's why we don't have it. So there's this collision of Tabor and Gallagher that is really creating this problem. So Tabor is in the Colorado Constitution. It is the most restrictive tax and expenditure provision in any state constitution in the country. The most restrictive tax and expenditure provision of any state in the country. For 25 years, the legislature has been trying to figure out a way to fund the necessary services that we need, and we've come to a point where we're in a hole in every area. We're in a hole, as I described, in the operational side of K-12 education. We're also in a hole on the side of capital construction. It's an $18 billion hole for capital construction, school repair and construction. It's a $7.3 billion hole on the operational side. At this point, my wife would be saying, stop being Debbie Downer, the old Saturday Night Live slide. So it sounds horrible, almost $25 billion. The state's budget's $30 billion, and just in K-12 education, we're at almost a $25 billion hole. And don't stop there as long as I'm on roll. We're not funding healthcare like we should. We all know that. We're not funding our universities and our colleges the way we should. We've shifted the cost over to families and students, and they're now carrying huge debt load. We used to subsidize our students in the state of Colorado about 2/3 of the budget, and that has sunk to less than 1/3. Boulder, the state only provides about 5% of their budget now.
Our public school.
There are, CU's almost a private university at this point. Transportation, you see it, drive the roads, easier to see than our other parts because you're driving on it instead of by it. But every aspect I can run down. Human services, we're in the middle of right now, the Joint Budget Committee carrying a complete overhaul of the child welfare system because we want better outcomes for students, but we don't have the resources to actually support adoptive families, foster care families, and move them out of congregate care. So I can go down the list of all these different things. So why am I running? You would say, well, there's just doesn't sound like there's any hope. But in fact, there is. I have a great deal of optimism, just like Phil does, that we can actually make a dent in this, but it's going to take a lot of political muscle. It's going to take a grassroots effort of people to actually say, we care about our communities and we want to invest in them, and let's start with our schools. So if I may, I don't know how close I am to time here.
Still got 11 minutes.
All right, well, let's make this transition then. So I mentioned, I said, when people say, well, we want our schools to be effective, and why aren't they now? We don't have enough funding to ensure that they're effective. And why don't we have enough funding in a hot economy, Tabor and Gallagher? Well, we have this initiative, 93, that's designed to change that. Initiative 93 is actually a petition to get a Colorado constitutional amendment on the ballot in November. And the Tabor part of that is, we're going to raise taxes. We're going to put in a graduated income tax into Tabor, which is in our Constitution, so that millionaires and wealthy corporations will pay more. Let me repeat that. We're gonna put in a graduated income tax so that millionaires and wealthy corporations are gonna pay more. Didn't they just get a nice break from Congress?
You did. I have a presentation, I could put up a few slides.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do a joint. Can we do a little bit of that? Let's do this. Let me stop here because we're gonna move into there. Let me just say this, a little factoid. One of the organizations, and again, this is a real grassroots effort that's behind this, is Great Education Colorado. Anybody heard of Great Education Colorado? Do you know the executive director of Great Education Colorado? Her name is Lisa Weil. Lisa was my 8th grade student in Greeley in 1976. Okay, so this has been professionally very rewarding. She is a brilliant person, Yale School, law school graduate who has devoted her energy back into the state of Colorado, doing grassroots organizing to improve the funding of K-12 education. And now has teamed up with a lot of other organizations, and Sarah will talk about all of those. And we'll talk about Initiative 93 and how it will have a positive impact for the state. But as treasurer, I want to get behind initiatives like this. I want to start building this political muscle out in communities to say, we got to take control of ourselves here in the state of Colorado. Let's stop shipping our money out of the state. Let's keep it here. Let's start investing in ourselves so we can move our state forward. Whether it's an adequate retirement system for everybody in the state, not just para-retirees, but everybody deserves a dignified retirement. Whether it's effective health care, whether it's great education for our K-12 students or for our post-secondary, whether it's human services that actually solve problems instead of creating more, we need to invest in ourselves so that we actually have a state that moves forward. We're tied up in this knot right now with Tabor and Gallagher, but we can start to untie that knot with leadership. I intend to be there working collaboratively with others, but I'm going to need your support at the grassroots level as well in order to pull this off. And so that's my plea to you. Britt's here today. She's my campaign coordinator, passed around a volunteer sign-up sheet. We have more information over on the side, but I'm going to need your support in order to actually move this forward. So let me stop there, take a few questions, and then we'll start to do a little joint presentation on Initiative 93. Yes?
Yeah, do you have competition in the primary?
I do. So I'm top line on the ballot, but I have another Democratic primary opponent. Bernard Douthit is on the primary ballot. I have at least 2 Republican opponents that are in the State House, Justin Everett and Polly Lawrence. Brian Watson, a big real estate developer, I think is finding a way to get his signatures on the ballot through petition. I guess we got rid of one of our opponents, Republican opponents in the Republican Assembly, Kevin Lundberg, the conservative Republican senator from Northern Colorado who sits next to me on the Joint Budget Committee daily, didn't make threshold, and so he's off. And in fact, he was pushing the Masterpiece Cake issue, and we fought for funding on the Office of Civil Rights right there at the Joint Budget Committee. So those of you that don't understand the Joint Budget Committee, we create a moral document, and we're fighting every day for these progressive values, but it's 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. So I'm going a little far afield of the question, but you know, we've been right in the trenches there, the 3 Democrats, me and 2 others that have been fighting for these progressive values. Does that answer the question?
Yes, and a lot more.
Yes.
And then, is there anything as treasurer that you could do to help oil and gas pay more equity for the?
Yes, actually, this has been attempted before, but you know, we're in the bottom third of Western states on effective tax rate. And so, you know, we have some counties that have benefited wildly from this. Weld County is one of them, 87.5% ad valorem tax, which is actually deducted when they pay their corporate tax. So we could change the ad valorem, we could change the stripper well deduction, we could actually take our money and tax it at a higher rate and put it into a trust like Wyoming and New Mexico and several other states have done. And we should have done that 30 or 40 years ago, or late to the game, but that's certainly something that the Treasurer's Office, with my knowledge of how we do legislation, could encourage our legislature to actually put on the ballot.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes?
As the treasurer, what could you do about the whole healthcare situation?
Well, I've been working on this actually, and I think part of the issue, and I mentioned my sister's challenge with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Our Medicaid system in the state of Colorado needs a lot of work, but if it was working well, it could be a very effective tool for actually providing people with access to effective health care. And to me, it's not whether you're covered or not, it's whether you're actually getting the health care you actually need. We have a fundamental conversation that we haven't had with every citizen in the state of Colorado. Is health care a right or is it a privilege? I firmly believe it's a right, and that we have to find a pathway. I've chosen a pathway to try to make sure that Medicaid works well for people, and that it actually provides them with the support and services that they need. Medicaid is much more than just health care. For those that are seniors, for those with disabilities, it actually provides them with housing options, it provides them with transportation options, it provides them with access to employment. So there's a variety of things, particularly I don't think for seniors care want to continue to be employed unless they want to, but people with disabilities dramatically want to be productive citizens, and our system is set up actually to force them into poverty and keep them from being productive citizens. And so there's a lot of work in Medicaid that we could do that actually expand it and make it a more viable option for a lot of people, maybe everybody in the state of Colorado. We're looking at that. I'm nervous about the attempts that the federal government Congress tried to cap Medicaid, either cap it or per capita cap, block granted or whatever, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the Atlantis Adapt people last summer when we fought against that vote, and they failed on one vote. So I'm a little nervous about driving forward Medicaid until we actually get a certainty from the federal government that it actually can grow and be a sustainable and viable option for people. But I know a lot about Medicaid, and I think it could be. Right now we're letting the Walton family use it as their benefit, part of their benefit package. They don't pay their associates enough. And so when the associates go to actually apply for the company health care, they can't afford it, so they hand them an application for Medicaid. Well, who's paying for that? Not the Walton family. We are. We shouldn't allow that to happen. We should actually, if they're going to force people into Medicaid, we should be billing them for that. I know they're destitute, the Walton family. Okay. What else?
Do you have any endorsements, David?
Yes, I do. See, she's always priming me. So I recently was endorsed by AFL-CIO, and I have several of the affiliates, including the American Federation of Teachers and Plumbers 3, I think, has endorsed me, and steel pipe fitters 208. I have several labor. I was president of the Teachers Association, the Teachers Union in Greeley, back in the mid-'80s. And so I've been a union guy for a lot of my life. Got the endorsement of CEA just before Colorado Education Association, right before State Assembly. And actually, I think back to all the progressive things I did when I was the lead bargainer. We were bargaining pay equity back in the late 70s, early 80s. We were bargaining universal health care, coverage for everybody. I mean, these are things that unions can do if we actually say we want more unions and expand union activity. You know, we just want to be sure that it's always positive and productive, but I think it can be. I've about, I don't know, 50 elected officials that have endorsed me, many of which are my colleagues in the State House and in the Senate. A lot of endorsements that way. They're all listed up on our website. You can check it out. What else did I forget? Britt?
I think you're solid.
Good. Well, I was down to 1 minute. So Sarah, why don't you come up and maybe we can tag team here.